Okay. All right. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to, first of all, thank you all for joining us tonight. I'd especially like to thank Professor Jim Diamond and Professor Kenneth Green for joining us on this call tonight. Please make sure that you are muted. I have muted everyone, but in case you've unmuted by accident, just make sure that you are on mute. We are going to be having time at the end of this conversation for some Q&A, if time, hopefully time will allow us, and hopefully no one will fall asleep before it's time to finish this evening. You know, during this pandemic, we have to start to think outside the box and think creatively. And the fact of the matter is that I get very excited about having the opportunity to dialogue with very scholarly people who know a lot about Jewish thought, Jewish philosophy, from all different periods of Jewish history. The fact of the matter is that we have a treasure trove of such scholars right here in our backyard in Toronto. And the fact is that I could have just as easily invited a scholar from Israel or from Massachusetts and had the same type of conversation. But because I have the privilege of knowing these two gentlemen that I'm sharing the dais with tonight, Dr. Diamond and Dr. Green, it was just a little bit easier logistically to get them to come on the call. There's a lot for us to talk about tonight. We called this discussion the God of Maimonides, and it's really a discussion about Jewish theology, issues of emunah, issues of faith, especially looked at from the lens of Maimonides. And I think that this is an especially important time for us to be thinking about the relationship that we have with God in the midst of a pandemic. And I'm going to ask a question of both of our panelists tonight that may be perceived as a bit chutzpahdik, but it's a question that needs to be asked because I've been asked this question when people in the Orthodox community have heard that we're having such a panel. And the question is as follows to our two august professors. You are not rabbis, and you are not speaking to us from the Beis Medrash. So what gives you the authority to define for us how we're supposed to think as Jews and how we're supposed to understand the Rambam? That's my, and I say it in this, I said, I love you both and I respect you both, but I'm asking you the question in a way that would be presented to me. In other words, Rabbi, you know, they're not in the yeshiva, they're in the university. Where do they get off telling me about what I'm supposed to believe and what I'm not supposed to believe? So if I could ask either of you to take this question first, please go ahead.
Ken, okay, I'll go ahead because
yeah, please, Jim.
I scooped Ken. I mean, Ken will come after. I just want to distinguish what you said. What Jews are supposed to believe. I'm not sure that either me or Ken are going to maybe talk about that. I think we're qualified perhaps to tell you what we think the Rambam might have believed. And that's not necessarily binding on everybody. You know, we're looking at it from, obviously we have a stake in this because we're Jews, and actually both of us are kind of traditional Jews. So, you know, from the point of view of, you know, what right do I have to tell you? I don't have a right to tell you what you're supposed to believe, but I think, have a little bit of a right to tell you what I think the Rambam believed. After many years of studying both his halachic works and his philosophical works, and have written about it quite a bit. So that's my, you know, I don't mean this in any way to say that I'm a posek. This is a matter of theology, so I'm not telling people what they have to believe. But one thing that I've come to know after all these years is that there isn't, you know, whenever my students ask me, for instance, what do Jews believe on A or B or C? And if somebody says, this is what Jews believe on virtually any matter, including the subject of tonight, which is the conception of God, then I tell my students, run for the hills, because that's simply not the case. Maimonides, and perhaps we'll discuss this a little bit later, I think had a very different conception of something we think that all Jews believe in the same God. Well, maybe the same God, but very, very different conceptions of God, very different conceptions of all kinds of things that we take for granted, like hashgacha, providence, miracles, creation, nevuah, prophecy, all these things. We have very, very different viewpoints in our tradition from Rishonim, from the most prominent Rishonim. If you would want to believe what people out there say, that this is what Jews believe, we probably would only have one sefer, one book in the Beit HaMidrash, but we have many. And so authority, I'm not going to say I'm an authority, but I think I claim a little bit of a right to at least present the position of Maimonides and others on, I think, some of the questions you're going to ask.
Thank you. And I should have done this at the opening, but James Diamond is a full professor and the Joseph and Wolf Lebovich Chair of Jewish Studies at the University of Waterloo and former director of the university's Friedberg Geniza Project. And now we go to Dr. Kenneth Hart Green, who's a professor of modern Jewish religious thought in the Department for the Study of Religion and in the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Toronto, but also, don't let the title deceive you, also a Maimonides expert, I think more through Leo Strauss than anything, but correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Green.
No,
would you tell us, would you answer the question the same way? I mean, you're not a rabbi, and yet you're going to be telling us things that are really the underpinnings of all of Jewish faith. And why should we listen to you and not listen to a Rosh Yeshiva instead?
Well, I don't really, would never presume to be telling people what to believe. I don't see myself in that role. But I also want to add that I don't think that is really what we do as Jews. I guess this is kind of an adding on to what Professor Diamond said, that our Jewish way, even though I know Rambam is associated with the 13 principles of faith, and some people object to that, long debate and controversy over that, whether there are these 13 principles. And this is still, but I think that one of the, maybe it's somewhat unconventional to say this, but I can say a little bit about what, like Professor Diamond, Jim, I can say what I think Rambam believed or thought or taught. But I think that also what Rambam wanted us to do, and don't forget the topic tonight is not the God of Judaism, the God of Torah, but the God of Maimonides. So we're talking about one Jewish thinker. I mean, there's
I'm sorry, I muted you by accident. Can I ask you to unmute yourself, Ken? Sorry.
Sure, there. Am I back on?
Yeah, you're back on. I apologize.
So I think that one of the things that I have learned from studying Rambam for many years is that, contrary to the impression that we get from many people, he wanted us to engage in this kind of discussion. He was not simply trying to put an end to it. Like, he didn't give us the 13 principles so that, okay, now nobody will think anymore or discuss anymore. But he wanted us to be, this is part of the process of, you could call it midrash, of understanding what the Torah wants and what the tradition wants. And so I think it's perfectly legitimate, whether again, I'm not telling anyone what to believe, but I think it's perfectly legitimate to discuss what I think or Jim thinks the Rambam was teaching, and beyond that, what I may think or whatever. But again, it's only on a personal level that I would claim or presume to offer these opinions. I'm not beyond what I will say what I think the Rambam actually believed, but I won't say what I think other Jews should believe. That's for them to work out for themselves, I think.
Thank you. I mean, I think that was worded quite well. An academic provides us information about Jewish history and Jewish authorship and what great rabbinic figures had to say, and does not tell us, does not act as a theologian telling us what is acceptable or unacceptable to believe. And so I guess sort of a corollary to that question is, are you both kosher? And I get that question a lot. Are these kosher people? And I've never tasted you, so I can't say whether you're kosher or not. But I would say that your thinking is kosher. And it's probably a fair thing to say that in the difference between the Beit Midrash and the yeshiva and the academy, when it comes to the study of Maimonides, is that in the Beit Midrash, we focus more on the halachic aspect of the Rambam. In the academy, there's a greater focus on the philosophy or the theology of the Rambam. And therefore, oftentimes when we're looking for greater clarity in what the Rambam actually said, it does become necessary. Not that there weren't great rabbis who also commented on the Rambam. I mean, we have a treasure trove going back almost to the lifetime of the Rambam of people who interpreted him and explained him. But in the 20th century and certainly the 21st century as well, there's a greater amount of literature about the Rambam's theology being churned out of the academy than perhaps the Beit Midrash. Certainly in North America, perhaps that's not the case in Israel today. It's be an interesting study of contrasts. All right, I wanted to, now that we've put that out of the way, I want to really get to our subject. Professor Diamond, you've been quoted in a few years ago, we had a panel together with Dov Friedberg when we were discussing a prior book of yours, where you made a very a controversial statement that the Rambam's God was different from the God of Ramban, Nachmanides, and to the point where Maimonides might think of Nachmanides as an idolater of some kind. Could you please explain who the God of Maimonides is? And as a follow-up to that question, is that good for, is Maimonides' depiction of God good for the Jews or bad for the Jews? And I'm going to leave that broad, and I want both Professor Green and Professor Diamond to attack that, please.
Okay. So if we were to take, as you mentioned, the two, to my mind, if I can evaluate, probably the two most important of the Rishonim, of the medieval thinkers, we call them Rishonim, it would be, and I think probably many people would agree with me, it would be Nachmanides the Ramban and Maimonides the Rambam. And in those days, I think people might have been a bit more honest, whereas now I hear people trying to turn the Rambam to align him with whatever they believe. The Ramban knew exactly what he meant and didn't try to transform the Rambam into a Nachmanidean. He took him on various issues. So, you know, I thought the best way to approach this would be just to, if I could read to you something I wrote about this, which is that would distinguish the two, and what I think are two different gods. Two different gods, actually. I would say it from a philosophical point of view, to say there are two conceptions of the same God. We can talk about this. I think conceptions of something can be so different that you end up with two different things, especially with something like God, where we don't really see God. So it's only a conception, or it's only something we can talk about in the abstract. And therefore, if you define it so differently than I do, then is that two different conceptions of the same God, or is it two different gods? So Nachmanides' mystical conception of God is a composite of Kabbalistic components known as Sfirot, a multiplicity of attributes, a deity who can be affected and about whom much can be known and positively asserted. Maimonides' God, in contradistinction, is an irreducibly unified being, absent of any attribute whatsoever, who can only be described by what he is not, and who essentially eludes all linguistic attempts to grasp him. Nachmanides' God is a God of history, affected by and interacting with the material world, responding to human conduct, intervening in temporal matters, while Maimonides' divine being transcends all time and space so absolutely as to allow for no possible nexus between them. He is absolute perfection, stable, constant, immutable, invulnerable by definition to any effects. Miracles are a commonplace of Nachmanides' world. He considers belief in them as the basic fabric of the world and a fundamental principle of faith. He goes so far to state, and I think on this score, he would differ than Maimonides on a fundamental of faith. That is, anybody who believes that the world goes its customary way, that is by nature, and does not believe that everything in the world is really miraculous, that is nature, there's no such thing as nature, he doesn't have a portion in the Torah of Moshe. Yet Maimonides, I would say one of his favorite statements is, Olam kiminhago noheg. The world goes its customary way. In fact, that's a principle of his, that God does not intervene necessarily in the way we think. God doesn't interfere in history, and God, perhaps in a correct interpretation was, God doesn't actually perform miracles in response to historical events the way we think. So that's just a kind of a little bit of introduction to, I think, the differences between two, perhaps the most prominent thinkers in Jewish thought, Jewish theology, and halakha. So I think they would be accepted in all worlds. I think this is interesting. That is, we probably would not be talking about, and people in the rabbinic world would not be so vexed by what the Rambam said in his philosophical works, had he not also been the most prominent halachist in the world, and left us with the most important, really the first code of Jewish law. So we can, the yeshiva world can dismiss. In fact, I would say many of them never even heard of people we think are important. Yehuda Levi, the Kuzari, I don't know. Like, I mean, I don't think guys in the yeshiva in the rabbinic world could care less about the Kuzari, except in very kind of narrow circles, because he wasn't the most prominent in both worlds. So Maimonides also says these things, these kinds of conceptions of God, this incorporeal kind of God, the kinds of things I mentioned about God in his Mishnah Torah as well. That is, on these points, there are many, many consistencies. In fact, right at the beginning of the code, between the way he describes God and the way he describes God in the Guide of the Perplexed. So
the God that you're describing is, the dichotomy that you're drawing is between the transcendent God of Maimonides and the immanent God of Nachmanides, who lives with us in this world. And by the way, please don't mess with Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. It'll affect book sales.
I know, you know what, I'm sorry. I know Rabbi Kropkin is an expert in Yehuda Halevi, but you have to admit that in the rabbinic world, I'm not so sure he's he's that important.
I mean, I think he sought not so much for his theology, but for his poetry of Judaism, but that's another discussion. Right. Anyway, I wanted to get to Dr. Green. Assuming, well, if you disagree, let us know. But assuming that you agree, is the God of Maimonides the better God? Who's the better God for the Jewish people? The transcendent God of Maimonides or the immanent God of Nachmanides?
Well, I wouldn't really put it in those terms. I don't really think. I think that we begin with the Rambam, with Maimonides. He is the beginning point for everything. What I think it was Isidore Twersky, I'm going to quote from memory, I may get it wrong, but I get the gist of it right, who is both a Harvard professor and the Tolner Rebbe. And he's the one who said that all of Jewish intellectual history since, I don't know, about the year 1200, has been a debate about the advantages and disadvantages, the for and against of the position of the Rambam. So I would put the Ramban together with a whole group of other people, maybe the Kabbalists, the Zohar, even let's say Isaac Abravanel is not exactly in either camp on one side, and then you have the Maimonideans coming out of claiming to be the true heirs of the Rambam, but going off in all kinds of different directions, whether one talks about, Ralbag or Sonides, or whether one talks about Yosef Albo. I mean, there's different ways in which one interprets. So the real question is the Rambam. I think that's the heart of it. And that's why I kind of like the way you framed the discussion today. And that means, okay, let me add to that one other point, that everybody pretty much, I would say everybody, I'm not even going to qualify that, who comes after the Rambam accepts certain fundamental points that he makes. Their debate is about, I guess, what I would have to call secondary points, subsidiary points.
Well, couldn't it be argued, Dr. Green, and and I know this is a subject that's very much undertaken by Menachem Kellner in his Maimonides Confrontation with Mysticism, that those who came after the Rambam either accepted him or had to go up against him in their writings. And could not one say that all of Jewish philosophical and theological writing since the Rambam has been in some way a dance either with the Rambam or against the Rambam in some way?
I would agree with that, but I'm the great respect for Professor Kellner, but I don't quite agree with the way he frames the question. I do think that the Kabbalists, the mystics, were themselves under the rubric of the Rambam. They reformed Jewish mystical traditions going back for another 1,000 years and turned them in a way that fit, under the way that the Rambam thought and the way that he defined the God of Judaism, I guess one could say. So, I mean, there's nobody who's defending. Okay, well, let's take the most fundamental point, and maybe you want to get into this. I don't want to go this way if you prefer to save it. The question of whether God has a body, the corporeality of God, or what Maimonides insists we must believe. Everybody must believe this. The highest philosophers, the highest rabbis, the highest, along with the simplest, people, children, all the simple people have to accept that God does not have a body. Now, everyone who goes into whatever stream we think of as Jewish, whether we go into the one stream, the right hand or the left hand, are all going to basically accept that. But they will then add qualifications. One will say, yes, God does not have a body, but he manifests himself in a way in the world that has a kind of bodily aspect to it, the sphirot, etc. And that works out in other ways that makes him immanent, as you put it, within the world. But the true essence of God, as far as we know it, is incorporeal. So there's nobody left really. People that criticized him, Rabbi Abraham ben David Rabad, when he took issue with the way Rambam presented the question of corporeality, did not defend the notion that the true Jewish conception is that God has a body. He simply took issue with the way Rambam worked that out in terms of how he applied it to ordinary people. Do they deserve to be, denounced as sort of heretics? Or can we say, well, they too have a concept that's kind of respectable, even if they're not particularly intelligent and articulate? But he wasn't defending them. So what I'm saying is the Rambam basically cleared the field. There's nobody after him so the Ramban also wants not to argue that God is a body, but as God relates himself to us in the world, there's, so to speak, a bodily or corporeal or material or immanent aspect of his presence in the world. But his true essence, his true being, however we understand that, that's beyond body. So we're really not arguing whether the Rambam is right or wrong. We're arguing, how do we interpret the Rambam? How do we play out the Rambam one way or another? One way saying, well, yes, he doesn't have a body, but we can accept their sort of bodily manifestations in one respect or another. And others say, no, we must stick by the Rambam said, in the pure and unadulterated fashion. So that's what
Dr. Diamond. Thank you, Dr. Green. Dr. Diamond, would you agree with, which side would you take in this dialectic? Is the Kabbalistic stream that comes after the Rambam a restructuring of the Aristotelian spheres that the Rambam talks about? Or is it a polemic against the Rambam?
So there are those who've argued that the Kabbalah, perhaps going back to Yehuda Levi and earlier, itself is driven as a response to Maimonides' kind of austere rationalist view of God, and trying to reinfuse a kind of biblical myth, the mythic God, back and restore it. I think it's a very different God. By the way, I wanted to point out, you mentioned two ways that the Rambam has been dealt with, either for or against. Of course, there's a third very interesting way, which also shows the importance of the Rambam, which is those people who reread the Rambam, including Kabbalists, all the way up from the Middle Ages all the way up to modern times. This is still going on. who reread Maimonides in light of their own theologies. And this is actually the subject of mine and Menachem Kellner's last book, which makes for very, another substantial part of our theology. But I wanted to go back. I think your question was, which is the better God, or
yeah, which is better for the Jews? In other words, if a Jew is searching for God, is trying to connect with God, which model is the better God, the immanent God or the transcendent God?
So the problem here, I mean, again, the better God, I mean, this is the God that I was describing and that Maimonides believed in. Maimonides believed this was a truth. So if you believe something is true, you can't have something better than that, right? You might want something better than that, but that's the truth, right? For Maimonides. The question I think that you're relating to is, what is the kind of God that most people can relate to better? That's a different question. So the question for Maimonides, I think, is the truth. But the problem is that his God is not a God that most people can relate to, which is an important term, because it's not really a God that one can have what we would consider a relationship. Relationship, usually we think of relationship as built on mutuality, reciprocity. You can't have a relationship that's one-sided. I wouldn't call that a relationship. And so a relationship that's giving, one gives to the other benefits, that person gives to you and you benefit, and there's kind of a mutual embrace. That's not the God of Maimonides. And so we're talking about something he believed was true. And so he was interested in, of course, the general humanity, the general populace, all Jews. And so that was the reason he formulated those 13 principles. Those 13 principles are very, very concise, kind of a digest of things he actually thought were true. And so at least give people a semblance of what's true. And then he understands there are different ways people are going to take that.
Well, I'll tell you why I'm asking the question. There are so many things that we as 21st century Jews are involved with in our daily life. And we do these things because we feel we want to have a sense of a higher purpose. We want to be able to connect to God more. We want to be able to feel that we're living for something that is more purposeful and that God is shining a light upon us, especially during these last few months of our isolation. A lot of us have been focusing on prayer, just as one example. Prayer for the Rambam would perforce mean something very different from prayer for the Ramban, who has a personal God. Let me also point something else out. We're in the midst of a pandemic. Is God working according to some kind of transcendent, preordained system where it's a cause and effect, this pandemic, or is there a God who is very involved with human history? And this is not something that is being doled out as a result of some kind of stimulus from down below necessarily, but may have some kind of mystical reason that is unknowable. I'll give you, just a quote. In the 6th century, the Christian philosopher Boethius wrote The Consolation of Philosophy, explaining how philosophy could act as a consolation when one is presented with suffering in life. What would the Rambam say about how we would approach, why is God presenting us, our world, with a pandemic? And are we supposed to view this as a punishment from the divine? What is the Rambam's philosophy on divine retribution, on Hester Panim? And does it provide us comfort in a world that we're living through today?
Ken, all right, Maimonides, I think this particular, so when Maimonides talks about suffering and evil in the world, he talks about three different kinds of evils. And this, for instance, this pandemic, I think would be, the way he would consider would be very problematic for perhaps a lot of the traditional conceptions of the way God operates in the world, because that he would consider the first evil he talks about is natural evil. That is things like tsunamis, hurricanes, diseases. These aren't things that are that human beings inflict on other human beings, or a product of choice, evil choices by one human being on another, but they're simply part, he would say, they are inherent in what he calls the material world. That's simply the way the world is. And so these things happen. Things that are subject to what he calls generation and corruption, things that are born and die, the fact that things break down in the world, the fact that things die, that's simply the way it is. That's simply the way it is. What I think he would say, and so the pandemic, I think, would be part of that. I don't think he would ever say, you hear religious voices say, for instance, this is because of, I don't know, the sin of homosexuality. I think he would think that's nonsense, because that's not the way God operates. However, what I think he would say is that what these things do, these plagues, is they evoke a moment of when people should reflect on the world. That is, the pandemic is something that should wake us up and say, well, what is, I mean, he was a man of science. And he would say, well, what is the cause of this pandemic? Why is it there from a scientific point of view? The reason we have evil in the world, he says in another kind of evil, is because of ignorance. And so there are things that maybe we didn't do that we should have done that allowed the pandemic to come into the world, not because of punishment, not because of sin, but there is a sin of ignorance. There is a sin of not understanding nature, of not understanding God's creation. And the closest we come to God for Maimonides is by understanding his creation, because he's the creator. So I think these pandemics are not a result of this kind of theological causality. There's some sin, and whatever your flavor of the day sin is, you're going to say that it's that sin. It evokes a moment of reflection where, and for instance, in his laws of fasting, he says something like a pandemic. There's a mitzvah to gather together and proclaim a fast. It's a time of reflection, a time of a community to get together and perhaps reorient the way they're looking at the world, not necessarily as a punishment, but reorient the way they've looked at the world in the past. Maybe there's something wrong in the way we've looked at the world in the past, reorient that in order for us to come closer to what he considered the truth.
So just for those who are studying Moreh Nevuchim, just a little plug, we do have a weekly class on Monday mornings on webyeshiva.org Facebook Live page. If you wanted to look that up in the Moreh Nevuchim, that's section 3, chapter 12 in the Moreh Nevuchim. What Professor Diamond is describing are the three causes of evil that exist in the world. And the Rambam does say that suffering is, or what he calls hester panim, God hiding his face, is really commensurate to man. In other words, God's providence, the amount of hashgacha pratit, or divine providence that God brings into the world, is contingent upon how much man focuses on God, how much man uses his intellect to appreciate God. And so therefore, what you're suggesting, Dr. Diamond, is that in the Mishnah Torah, when he talks about gathering for fasting, he's saying that it's necessary in order to mediate or to obviate a plague, is that we have to raise our intellectual understanding and focus on God so that we'll be deserving of hashgacha pratit, of more divine providence, and that will be the way of alleviating the plague. Not really a conventional way of how you would look upon reward and punishment, though, right?
Right.
Is that that's certainly not a conventional way that we would think today about turning towards Hashem and asking him to save us from the pandemic. But Is it possible that the Rambam would look at the pandemic today and he would say, well, the world wasn't thinking about God. And maybe he brought this pandemic because he wanted to raise people's attention to start focusing more on issues of God. And this is his way of doing it. Is that acceptable for the Rambam, do you think?
I would say no. That is the way you formulated it, is that he brought the pandemic. So again, this is a very difficult thing for conventional kind of Orthodox thinking to get their heads around, is that it's simply part of the world. There actually is, in a sense, God isn't really behind the pandemic. So when you said he brought the pandemic is simply something that is part of a material world that is inherently breaks down, right? It inherently breaks down because it's material. It's not like abstract, spiritual, let's say, what we would normally call spiritual.
Okay, but if I may interject at this point, some might read that passage in the Rambam from chapter 12 that I mentioned as the natural course of order. People are born and people die, people get sick, people get cancer. These are statistically naturally occurring things that happen. Pandemics, though, only happen once a century, at best. Does the Rambam not have a place for these very rare occurrences that affect huge populations all at once? The Rambam doesn't feel there's any role that God plays in consciously bringing this phenomenon about? Dr. Green, do you want to interject at this
I just
point?
want to add a couple of little, I basically agree with everything that Jim said, but I want to add a couple of sort of footnotes, additions to that. One is that the view that Jim is expressing can sound like the Rambam was a bit hard-hearted, but I don't think that is correct in terms of how he was as a human being. If you read him, and not just his books, but his letters, you see that he was a very compassionate man for people who were suffering and had great concern for them, and thought that it was our duty as human beings also to be concerned for other human beings who are suffering. One of the ways in which we express that concern is by pursuing science and knowledge in a way that will alleviate the suffering of other human beings. So there's a motive in it. Now, as for God's role in it, I think there's a little nuance that we have to add. I think you're right to bring in the fact that the pandemic is different from the ordinary slings and arrows of nature. I think there are three causes of evil in that chapter. One of them is natural, the other is political. There's an element and moral too, by what we do to ourselves, but that's not so key here. But the political element has to be reflected on. Then the world as it exists, so let me just take that a step further. This should be an opportunity for introspection. This should be an opportunity for wondering about ourselves and how we've lived. This should be an opportunity for thinking about things we may have done wrong. It doesn't mean that God is directing this at us in a way that, that suggests that, one particular sin is being focused on, but it could be that there are elements in the way that we've been living which are not right, which therefore do not conform with what God wants. And that involves nature and politics and morality. And that reflection on our human situation is imperative in a situation like this, so that we deal with it properly and ensure it doesn't happen again as much as we can. Of course, there's no guarantee we can prevent it again, but all of this is part of wrestling with it. And in a sense, I guess here one could speak metaphorically from Rambam's point of view. There is a will expressed in this, in the sense that the world is built in a certain way, and we have not been operating in a way that could have perhaps taken the world in its best and human behavior in their best way. So we are partly responsible for this, and we do have to deal with those elements of our behavior that are responsible. So in that sense, there is a kind of metaphorical hand of God on us in this, which we should listen to and revise our behavior accordingly.
What I'm hearing are different nuances of the Rambam's theology that God's level of providence is contingent upon mankind's behavior, or mankind's intellectual endeavors to try and become closer of an understanding of God. And the more that one understands of God, the more divine providence they will be deserving of, so that certain catastrophes will not take place, because God will be much more mindful of those individuals or communities who are more attached to divine thought, divine intellect. Now,
Can I add a little, sorry, for a moment, just to give an example of the kind of thing I think we're talking about? It's not a perfect example for an analogy for the pandemic, but it has something about it. You know, if people build their lives and their city and their civilization on the side of a volcano, then they may find that the volcano erupts and destroys them, and they'll say, well, why did this happen to me? And of course, you know, it may be that they should have figured out from the beginning that it's not a good idea to live on the side of a volcano, so that people didn't act properly. And in that sense, they were disobeying God's will in doing the way that they were. So there, you know, there's a way of understanding this that does cohere with a more traditional pattern of thought. But of course, it does go back to knowledge and understanding and science and proper behavior, I guess one could say, in all spheres. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you though, Rabbi.
No, that's okay. Behavior or thought, or a combination of both, the behavior that engenders thought. Okay, I want to get to.
I just wanted to interject
Sure.
one more time, because there's something that he says also that's relevant to this, which is quite unconventional. Also, I would say probably radical, is that there are beliefs for Maimonides that are true, and there are necessary beliefs, which are not true, but are necessary. So one could argue, I'm responding kind of to Ken in this, one could argue that those things he talks about in terms of tefillah, of prayer, in terms of calling for a fast, that will kind of encourage people to do tshuva, might fall under what he calls necessary beliefs. That is, there are necessary beliefs that are helpful, because tshuva is something that's beneficial. One needs to reflect on his past, see if he did something wrong, and understand that there's a possibility of rehabilitating oneself. But the fact that there is that kind of theological causality that works, that is, that you do something and therefore God will pay you back for that, or you do something and God will punish you for that, Maimonides might consider, and this is something that would really fly in the face of a lot of Orthodox theology, is a necessary belief, but not a true belief. So there is that factor to take into consideration.
I'm not sure I understood the difference between necessary and true.
So there are things that are necessary. For instance, if I want to put it in a kind of a trivial way, where you tell a child a fairy tale, right? Little Red Riding Hood, Little Red, what was, yeah, right. That you tell a fairy tale, and that teaches a child not to talk to strangers. But the fairy tale itself is false. That is, it uses false kind of things that are fantasies, that are, let's say, science fiction, in order to teach something that's true. And so, for instance, a classic necessary belief for Maimonides, I'm not sure, you probably didn't get up to this in the Moreh Nevuchim yet, is anger, God's anger. So you have this in the Torah. Maimonides has a real difficulty with that, because he considers anger, really, in the Mishnah Torah, anger's the worst thing possible. In fact, anger borders on kfirah, on actual, you're a kofar if you get angry in an extreme way, right? So how could God be angry? So he says anger is a necessary belief in order to correct people's actions, but it's not a true belief. God does not get angry. God does not work that way. But it's something that the Torah uses in order to rehabilitate people. So that's something that.
Okay, I think we get it now.
Okay.
Now, I just want to make one comment on causality. The Rambam might have different terminology for reward and punishment, but there is a kind of cause and effect in the God of Rambam nonetheless. It's just not necessarily predicated on reward or punishment, but rather the degree to which someone is deserving of direct providence from God based upon their intellectual attachment to that God. So it is still a cause and effect. It's just not necessarily what we would call reward and punishment. That may be the necessary belief instead of the true belief. All right, I want to get to the recent book, Dr. Diamond, that you've recently published together with Professor Menachem Kellner from the University of Haifa. And that is, could you just tell us the title of the book again, please?
So it's called Reinventing Maimonides in Contemporary Jewish Thought.
Okay, so basically what it does, it's a fascinating work. It takes a bunch of great thinkers from the 20th century who used the writings of the Rambam as a platform to promote their own theology, ideology, philosophy of Judaism. And it demonstrates sort of it's of the genre of reception literature, it's what it's called. In other words, how the Rambam was received and used and manipulated in order to augment and to be used as a tool to promote one's beliefs, even if perhaps the Rambam may never have said what the later author said or believed what the later author believed. And I want to get specifically to one chapter that you have in that book about the Piazetzna, about the Holy Eish Kodesh Reb Clonimus Kalmus Shapiro, who used the Rambam extensively in his discussion of his discussion of the intellect and how it relates to God. And I believe this is going to relate to Dr. Green's work as well, because right now Dr. Green is in the process of finishing a book on Emil Fackenheim's philosophy, which is most famous being that there was a rupture that occurred as a result of the Shoah, and all previous theologies had to be reconstructed as a result of the Shoah, which changed the landscape of Jewish history and therefore perforce Jewish theology as well. Based upon what we've sketchily described as the Rambam's definition of hester panim and of reward and punishment commensurate to human behavior, human thought, I'd like you, Dr. Diamond, first of all, to describe how Rav Shapiro used the Rambam's discussion of intellect and turned it upside down or inside out to help make sense of the suffering that he was going through in the Shoah. And then if Dr. Green, if you could answer this question, based on what Fackenheim writes, if the Rambam had lived through the Shoah, would he have had to rewrite those chapters in the Moreh Nevuchim? Just a thought experiment.
Yeah, so this is a difficult question, and there's a particular sermon. So these are sermons that were delivered in the Warsaw Ghetto from the fall of 1939. Actually, before the Warsaw Ghetto was set up until the summer of 1942, and it's a rare, actually the only record we have of somebody struggling in the pit of hell, somebody of the stature, of the rabbinic stature of this Hasidic Rebbe of Colonos Kalman Shapiro. So when he gets, he at a certain point, he actually kind of argues with people who say, what's going on is just more of the same. We know how to deal with this. We've had the, that this is, people were arguing that this is unique, that we've never had to deal with this before. And Rav Shapira says, no, we've had the Churban, the destruction of the temples, Beitar, the Khmelnytsky massacres. We've been through this before. A year later, he actually goes back towards the end of 1942 and appends a note. This to me is really one of the most extraordinary responses to the Holocaust of anything I've ever read. And Ken can talk about this more, how it relates to Fackenheim as well, because he says, he actually appends a note and he says, this is no longer true. What I said there is no longer true. The suffering that we've experienced after that sermon I gave There is nothing like it. And you have to listen to his words, because I think he was very careful with his words. B'divrei Chazal, b'divrei Chachamenu, zichronam levracha, in the words of our rabbis, or b'divrei hayamim liYisrael. What he's saying is, neither in our theological toolbox, which classically the way we deal with suffering is to resort to the way Chazal dealt with the most extreme form of suffering, which was the destruction of the temple, or the loss completely of our homeland with Beitar and Bar Kokhba. So we don't have that. This suffering does not, we don't have the tools to deal with that. Or in our history, the Divrei Yamim L'Yisrael. So he's actually admitting, I think like Fackenheim, in his form of thought, Fackenheim dealt with philosophy, and Fackenheim is that there was a rupture in actually thought. For Fackenheim, that would have been philosophical thought. This is similar. That is, for him, for Rav Shapira, thought, simply thought, is for him theological thought, is the way the rabbis thought. And if he can't resort to those classic models, then he's in big trouble. So that's an extraordinary, honest, and painful note. And so when he gets to the Rambam, he said he tries to use the Rambam in also a very unique way to somehow eke out something positive to the tremendous suffering that's going on. And what he says is that the Rambam talks about knowledge, and the Rambam uses an Aristotelian formulation that when one knows something, one becomes one with the thing he knows. And when God knows something, God is one with that thing he knows. And God, and this is in the Mishnah Torah actually, nothing as radical as the Guide of the Perplexed. He actually says something, this formulation in the Mishnah Torah. He says, God knows everything because he knows himself. So everything that God knows is actually in his own being, and he knows whatever is in the world because he knows himself. So Rav Shapira takes this, what I think is an extremely rationalist interpretation of the bond between us and God, which is we use, as you quite rightly said before, we use our intellects, and the more we know, the closer we get to God. And he actually uses and turns it upside down. That is, for God to know everything and for us to become part of God is actually to overcome our intellects. Because if we continue to think that we know something, then we've put up a barrier between us and God. We've not allowed God to infuse our minds. And by saying we know something, that means that we're putting up a kind of an obstacle to God entering our minds. Then he says suffering, the extent of suffering actually crushes our minds to the extent that we can overcome the fact that we have, if I use a yeshiva expression, bias or ownership over our thoughts. And that will allow God to actually enter into the world and enter into our minds. And what we know is what God knows, and what God knows is what we know. But what he's doing is, in short, it's a complicated topic, but what he's doing is he's taking something that the Rambam, I think, used to say, the way we approach God is to reason our way towards God, not to ever abandon our intellect, but we always use our intellect. We understand more and more about the world. And as we understand more and more about the world, we become closer to the creator of that world. What Rav Shapira is saying is using that and saying, no, we reason our way towards overcoming reason to the point where we can enter the divine mind. And he uses suffering as a tool. Suffering can help us because suffering crushes our egos to the extent that the ego disappears, and then we become one with the divine mind. So it's really an extraordinary use of a Maimonidean intellectual formulation, turning into a kind of a Kabbalistic formulation where we become one with God through suffering.
Now, the theme that runs through your book is that there's a certain elasticity in the writing of the Rambam. Some authors took perhaps excessive liberties. Is this an example of someone who took something that was elastic enough in the writing of the Rambam for it to fit into his theology, or was this sort of a reconciliation that he needed to make in order just to cope with what he was actually living?
You know what? It's an excellent question, and I think actually the Rambam's formulation it lends itself to this kind of interpretation. When the Rambam says in the Mishnah Torah, for instance, which maybe actually be a more radical formulation than the Guide of the Perplexed, in the Mishnah Torah, which people say he wrote for a general audience, when he says that God the knower and what he knows and the knowing are all one, that lends itself to this idea that was taken over by Hasidut, including Chabad, very prominently by Chabad. And the Baal HaTanya, for instance, Shneur Zalman of Liadi, quotes this very often, this formulation that Rav Shapiro uses, to actually corroborate this idea that there is nothing but God. If God knows everything because he knows himself, then there is nothing else but God. There is nothing else. The world
Ein od milvado.
is, that's right. Ein od milvado. You know the way he reads that. Not that there isn't any other God, but there is nothing else but God. Rav Shapiro is continuing in this tradition, and the truth is, there is no question in my mind that he didn't think he was forcing the Rambam to be consistent with a theology that he needed. I think he absolutely believed this, and the Rambam's formulation lends itself to this kind of what's been called philosophical mysticism. Whether the Rambam understood it this way, I actually don't think so, but it does lend itself to this extraordinary interpretation.
All right, thank you, Dr. Green.
Well, you've crossed a line into the most difficult subject of contemporary Jews and Judaism, and all of us are going to have our own thoughts on this. I have been, as you say, working on Fackenheim, and I'm going to try to compress what I think I've learned, although Jim, of course, is also both of us were students of Fackenheim, and he's written on it, so he's going to have his own take on it, but I'll try to compress some ideas into some shorter words. First of all, let me just say that Fackenheim learns a lot from the Eish Kodesh, and he uses the Eish Kodesh. He doesn't agree with them on everything. There's some fundamental disagreements, but there's a lot of agreements, and they're quite fascinating. But I won't go into that now. Let's go back to the Rambam, which is where we started. Fackenheim was both a philosopher and a theologian. His early work was extremely impressive as a theologian, reflecting on the theme of revelation. And he thought that was the core of what we have to deal with. In 1967, he came to the 67 war, and his whole thought changed. And at that point, when it looked as if there could be a second Holocaust, he realized that we have been ignoring the issue, the elephant in the room, the issue that should have been the focus of all of our attention. Now, let me just go back a step. When Fackenheim started out as a scholar, he was both a Reform rabbi and a scholar of which he taught philosophy at the University of Toronto. He was a scholar of Maimonides. His thesis and his early work was focused on the Rambam. At a certain point, he came to he wrote a very impressive article, by the way, on the Rambam on creation, still used and referred to. He came to a certain conclusion, which was, now I don't think this conclusion was based on his awareness that he was thinking about the Holocaust, but I would venture to say it was in the back of his mind, that we cannot work with the Rambam's theology anymore. We must go beyond it. The first step beyond it was the first thing he said, which I guess people may know. I don't. In Toronto, certainly people would remember Fackenheim's one famous remark, as he said, the 614th commandment, namely that out of the Holocaust, out of the Shoah, came a new rule that we as Jews, and by the way, other human beings, everybody in the world should follow, which is not to give Hitler posthumous victories. Now that's a controversial subject, and I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I want to come closer to the theme that you asked about, Rabbi, which is the theme of rupture. What Fackenheim eventually decided, or came to the conclusion about, which is really where the break with the Rambam becomes clearest. And I think, by the way, you see the same break in the Eish Kodesh. And I would venture to say almost every great rabbi and theologian who lived through or even died during the Holocaust, who wrote on this, came to some conclusion similar to this. Namely, we cannot go on as if nothing has changed. We cannot treat theology as if everything that happened here was like everything else that happened before. Something happened during the Holocaust, which is unique, unprecedented, different. The Jewish suffering and the scale of it and the nature of the evil shatters every single framework that we previously thought worked to answer the question of evil.
So are we therefore to give up on the endeavor completely and just to resign ourselves? Or?
No, that's a very good question, actually, because that could be a conclusion one could seem to draw. But the 614th commandment prevents us from doing it. There are 4 elements of the 614th commandment. I don't know, I want to go into all of them, but let me just mention one of them, which is that we cannot despair of God, because that too would be a victory for Hitler. We cannot despair of man in the world. That would be a victory for Hitler. We must survive as Jews. That's the 3rd element. The fourth one is we must remember those who died in the Holocaust. Now, all of those things, but go back to the first one, we cannot despair of God because of what happened in the Holocaust. That's a commandment. That doesn't mean that many people didn't have that feeling or that response. But Fackenheim insists that we think through a response, as he calls it, not an explanation, not a theodicy, all those kinds of things that we used to have. When Rambam gives us 3 reasons of why there's evil in the world, he says, Fackenheim thinks that doesn't work, and that's not sufficient for what we've dealt with, what we've experienced in that period. So we have to work out a solution let me be careful with my words, a response which is consistent with Judaism as we have known it, or with God as we know, but yet also takes into account this unprecedented event, which does challenge everything that came before. So Fackenheim placed himself in the center between 2 other, at that time, active theologians who were writing on this. One, Richard Rubinstein, who said, after this, we have to give up on God. That's one, and that Fackenheim rejected that. And the other is Eliezer Berkowitz, who said, no, we can blame lots of people for doing wrong, but we can't change in any way our traditional notion of God. Fackenheim said that also is wrong. So he insisted on this concept of rupture as a way of expressing the notion that something had happened which had never happened before. And when something happens that's never happened before, we must learn to think new thoughts. We must try to struggle with it in a way that with equipment. Now, Fackenheim comes up with some answers, and I'm going to try to present a certain interpretation of his views in my book. And I hope I got it right, because he was my teacher, and I feel a great sense of fidelity to him. But, it's not an easy way to deal with it. And I don't know, I don't want to turn this into a discussion about Fackenheim, so I'm not going to.
Thank you. Is there any room for the God of Maimonides after the Shoah?
Oh, that's a tough question. Well, there is. Fackenheim is still a philosopher. He still believes in the power of the mind, but he thinks that during the Shoah, the mind reached its limit. Jean Amery wrote a book called At the Mind's Limit, that there is no way to have been a philosopher or a theologian who walked through the Holocaust as if, they had God and therefore they were protected from anything bad happening to them. And I think even the Eish Kodesh came to the same conclusion. Something there makes it impossible to think in the way that we had thought. So we still have our minds. We must use our minds. That's what the Rambam would have exhorted us to do. But we can't use them in the way and we can't rely on them. We can't say simply thinking, philosophizing, theologizing is enough. That's why, okay, well, here I do have to bring in one of Fackenheim's points. One of the commandments, if you will, that comes out of this, or sub-commandments out of the 614th, is the duty of what he calls resistance to evil. I think here he actually comes very close to what the Eish Kodesh was saying. So there comes a point where thinking, theologizing, even believing is not sufficient. It's what we do. Now, resistance can take many forms. There were, Hasidim who continued to observe the commandments, and Fackenheim considers that part of resistance. But there are others who fought in the Warsaw Ghetto, that also. There's what he calls a spectrum. But all of them refused to accept that this was a kind of verdict against them, that they were being punished for sins, or that they had somehow done something wrong. This was not the framework in which we could understand this event at all. So Rambam gives us the encouragement to use our minds. In fact, and I'm certainly used his mind, but it can't rely on the intellectual, closeness to God to be sufficient in our time as it was as a kind of formula for dealing with evil for the Rambam. We have to do much more. There are things we are obligated to do, and that comes out of he thinks that comes out of what people did during the Shoah itself, how they acted. They showed us how we should act.
Thank you. Now, it's not a little bit after 5 after 9, and I wanted to leave a little bit of time for questions. I only was able to get through about 3 or 4 questions tonight, but I want to give an opportunity, if anyone, this is a rare opportunity that we have to be able to have both Professor Diamond and Professor Green on a call. I also noticed that Professor Reinhold of Yeshiva University is on in our audience with us, and you were just here in Toronto and we didn't take advantage of you properly, and I regret that tremendously. But if anyone would like to type a comment or a question in the chat section, that would be the right time to do it before we call it a night. Would anyone like to present a question to one of our professors, or even to the lowly rabbi? No.
Oh, hi. This is Jesse. I just got on.
Hello, Jesse.
Yeah, I'm in Arizona. I see it's dark there, but it's still light here.
A few hours later.
It's a philosophical conundrum.
Happy Shavuos. Like I read on the calendar, Shavuos was on June 9th last year.
All right. Well, thank you, Jesse. I'm just going to go to the chat section over here. John Green asked the question, possibly a relation to one of the professors, I'm not sure. What would a modern orthodoxy guided by Maimonides look like today? Who would like to take that? What would a modern orthodoxy guided by Maimonides look like today? Dr. Diamond, you want to?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, in our book, for instance, we have a chapter on Rav Soloveitchik, Rav Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik, which actually Menachem wrote. And, some people would say he's the father, kind of one of the leading figures of modern orthodoxy in the 20th century. But he himself, if this is an indication, I'm not sure Maimonides would be the one that would be the patron saint of modern orthodoxy today either. Even Rav Soloveitchik did what, in a sense, Rav Shapira did as well. He did not go all the way with this intellectualist bond between human beings and God, and he ends up with halacha. Really is the thing that describes the world, and that forms the bond between human beings and the world. And in fact, he interprets Maimonides in some places that way. So the thing that I think that would be important for modern orthodoxy, perhaps one could argue that without the Rambam you wouldn't have modern orthodoxy, is his investment in understanding the world. So let me put it this way. I think the most important statement that would drive a modern Orthodox view of the world in the Maimonidean sense would be his formulation of love of God and fear of God that he has in the beginning of the Mishnah Torah. And his definition of the love of God is to look at the creation and to understand the creation in the best way you can, and that is the way you can understand and come to love the Creator. There's no way that I know you can do that. I think the Rambam understood that there's no way you can do that by not understanding the world. And what he means by that is not just learning Talmud and just learning halacha, but actually physics, chemistry, biology, all those things are actually part and parcel of the cardinal commandment of loving God, and it's ultimately the most important way of loving God. So that perhaps would be one dimension of a Maimonidean modern Orthodox world.
So perhaps more of the Torah Umada
That's right.
type of philosophy, not necessarily. You see, modern Orthodoxy means different things to different people.
Right.
The Torah Umada of modern Orthodoxy is definitely rooted in the Rambam. Coming to shul at 10:30 is not necessarily rooted in the Rambam.
Right.
Professor Green, would you have a different answer to that question?
I would just have a slightly different answer than Jim. I mean, I do think that the patron saint of modern Orthodoxy is the Rambam. I think all the formulations of it, whether it's Torah Umada, Torah of Chochma, I think that's Rabbi Sachs, Torah Derech Eretz, they all are the notion that there are these two worlds, in a sense, which we are obligated to live in: the world of Torah and the world, as it were, the created world, and that there's legitimacy in that, dealing with the world on its own terms, in nature, science, etc. So I think that, however, we may not want to accept every facet of the Rambam's teaching, but the basic program is, I think, a child of the Rambam. I don't think we would be thinking in these terms if we didn't have him, and he still remains the guiding spirit behind it. I think his, not to say everybody buys into everything about him, but I think his principles are those that, as modern Orthodox Jews, which I guess all of us are, we sort of follow in one way or another.
All right, thank you. From Noah Marlowe. This is a loaded question. Which Maimonides is the more quote unquote authentic Maimonides? Maimonides of the Guide or the Maimonides of the Mishnah Torah? And we know Rav Yaakov Emden, for example, believed that it was impossible that Maimonides could have been the real author of the Guide for the Perplexed. So, first of all, are they the same person? Was the Rambam schizophrenic? What's the answer to this question?
So Maimonides is a complex person, like most people. Most people are complex people, I think there are more interlocking kind of similarities between the Mishnah Torah and the Mor Nevuchim, and that's not to say that there aren't problems, or perhaps what people would call contradictions. So the authentic Maimonides is the one of both the Mishnah Torah and the Mor Nevuchim. The proof of the pudding is that what we just talked about, no code of law that I know of, and this includes the Shulchan Aruch, starts with Yesod HaYesodot v'Amud HaChachmot, the foundation of all foundations and the pillar of all sciences, right, is to know that there is this first being. He doesn't start with a mitzvah, which you would expect a legal code to start with. The mitzvah only comes much later. Which is a binding thing. He starts with something that's a universal imperative. And then he proceeds in his code of law to outline his theology, which his entire code of law is grounded in. The entire code of law is grounded in the Sefer HaMada, the if you want to call Mada science, not really science, the book of knowledge. If I can for a second, one of the books that we're waiting for now. There's a Yale Judaica series that's translating all the different volumes of the Mishnah Torah. The one that we still don't have is Sefer HaMada, which is being done now by Professor Septimus. We've been waiting like 30, 40 years for this. But to give you an idea of why he hasn't finished it yet, or why it hasn't been published yet, is he once wrote an article, and why the Rambam is so difficult. And when you ask the authentic Rambam, he once wrote a 70-page article on the meaning of the word Mada, the meaning of the word Mada. And at the end of the day, my head was spinning. Okay, but I asked him. I met him once a year ago, and I said, "So what did you decide to call Sefer HaMada?" So he says, "In the end, I called it the Book of Knowledge." So it's always been called, but that gives you an idea of how hard it is to say the authentic. But the authentic Maimonides is the one who combines both halacha both the mitzvot as a system that he thinks is the most ideal system within which to cultivate all those ideas that he develops in the Moreh Nevuchim. So you can't have one without the other. You can't have one without the other. What is more important or less important, that's something we can discuss another time. I think he thought the Moreh Nevuchim and what he calls the Masa Merkava and Masa Breshit, or physics and metaphysics, were the most important subjects. He actually says that in the Mishnah Torah as well. But you can't have one without the other. So the
It's also fair to say that they were written for two different audiences.
You know what? I don't really accept that. I think they were written for the sophisticated audiences, including those who were steeped in the rabbinic tradition, the halachists, and those who simply needed to know what to do and what not to do. There are times when perhaps that might be an answer to things that contradict what he says in the Mishnah Torah, like, for instance, the issue of sacrifices, which we haven't even got to. But I think on the whole, I think the Mishnah Torah was, there's a symbiotic relationship between the two. Professor, for instance, Isidore Tversky, that Ken Green mentioned before, really concentrates a lot on this. And I think it's too simplistic to say he wrote this for this audience and that for another audience. So the Mishnah Torah is a very sophisticated book as well. I don't think that's for, let's say, the common man. Right? So the authentic Maimonides is the one that wrote both.
We have a very thoughtful question from Sam Fleischhacker. Do any of the three panelists agree with Dr. Fackenheim that the Shoah changes fundamentally the way that we have to view so evil, to the point where we have to revise our idea of God? And the question is predicated on the argument, wouldn't the horrors that accompanied the destructions of the first and second temples or the Crusades have been enough to change that idea, if anything must do that? Why is the evil of the Shoah worse in principle, if it is, than these other evils? And perhaps you'll argue that it's maybe in magnitude. Maybe the destruction of the temple was 1 million people and the Shoah was 6 million people. But when you think about it, is there something so fundamentally different about the Shoah? Do you agree with Professor Fackenheim?
I do. I agree with him. I think he, but I think he insisted, by the way, there were people who were sympathetic to him and who shared many views with him, who agreed with that view that nothing, fundamental had changed. I'm on Zoom. But I think that he, his point is that if you look at the particulars, if you look at what happened, you see, and I'm not going to go into the details of his argument here, that this was something which was unlike anything which had happened before. So he's talking from the point of view of historical facts, not sort of theological dogmas here, that historically this is an unprecedented event, and it's unlike anything that's either happened to the Jews before or anything that's happened to any other people. And terrible things happened in the 20th century, terrible things, but they are not as bad, according to Fackenheim, as what happened there. And those facts are the things that should convince us to think differently, not because we've sort of laid it down as some kind of, dogma beforehand. So
was it because it was a more systematic genocide? Is that the reason?
Yes, the intention was to murder every last Jew, man, woman, and child. Fackenheim emphasized 1 million children were killed, and they were killed deliberately. This wasn't an accident, as might have happened in other previous events. There was the systematicness of it, the intention of it, the technology of it, the propaganda of it, the fact that most of the world collaborated in, or at least passively accepted it, the fact that it was the heartland of the Jews, the fact that 1/3 of the Jewish people, and that, as Fackenheim says, if the Nazis had won the war, there would not be a single Jew left in the world. That's not like the destruction of the temple. That's not like the Crusades, and it's not like the expulsion from Spain, things with which it has been compared before. In none of those cases do any of these factors, and there are actually more, I haven't even included them all, in Fackenheim's understanding of why it was unique. But it's something people resist. I understand that. It's a terrible claim to have to wrestle with. But I do think he's got something we have to contend with. I'm not going to necessarily say everybody will accept it, but it's something one has to contend with and one can't dismiss, because I think it's something people resist. It's a very hard thing to live with that if it's true.
Okay, there's someone who asks a question. I want to restructure the question a little bit based upon the current events about what has happened especially in the U.S. in the past week with the murder of a peaceful Black man, George Floyd. In the news, people are talking about racism as one of the greatest ills of today's society. Can you reflect on the Rambam's more universalistic view of God, of prophecy, of commandments, in contradistinction, say, to someone like Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, whose more particularistic approach to Judaism and to the Jews' relationship to God may have opened him up to the accusation of racism? And how would you suggest that a Jew using this classic medieval philosophy should frame his approach to the other in light of what's going on in current events?
Yeah, so I think on this score, if you want to pit Maimonides against, for instance, the Kabbalistic tradition, Maimonides is the better side to be on. So that, for instance, if you open up the Moreh Nevuchim and start with the very first chapter where he talks about image, an image of God, there is nothing in there that talks about a Jewish image of God. There's the image of a God that that a human being has. And if I can, one of the things, and actually one of the chapters in our book is turned right around, but I find there's a lot of resistance to this, precisely because it's so universalistic, which really we as Jews need to change. Is at the end in the Mishnah Torah, so you don't have to go to the Moreh Nevuchim. So as far as I know, anything he says, even about prophecy is not confined to Jews. It's actually something that one merits when one reaches a certain state of intellectual perfection, whether Jew or non-Jew. But if you want to take the Mishnah Torah and somebody has that question about the authentic Maimonides, here's, I think, some place where they both converge. At the end of the laws of the Jubilee and the sabbatical years, he talks about the tribe of the Levites that were totally dedicated to God. And because they were totally dedicated to God, they didn't actually take part in civil society. They didn't own property. They didn't fight in wars. And then he says the following. He says, and not only the tribe of the Levites, but any person, he says, Mikol Ba'e Olam, for anybody who enters the world can aspire to this kind of lifestyle and become a holy of holies. Any person who can dedicate himself totally to God and become like this tribe of this model that kind of doesn't, is wholly dedicated to thinking about God. So I've had these arguments where people, are you mean to tell me that the Rambam is saying that a non-Jew can aspire to be the holy of holies? I say, well, actually, that's what he says, right? And there's no way of reading Ba'e Olam, those who enter into the world, neither in the ways he uses it in other places, Maimonides, and neither in the way the rabbis use it in the Talmud. It means simply all people, all human beings. So from that point of view, I would say that the Rambam has a lot to teach us. And if I can, especially with respect to what's going on, he has the following to say in the Mishnah in Eduyot that talks about what the Messiah will do, what Eliyahu will do when he comes in to herald in the Messiah. So the majority position says that the Messiah, the Eliyahu doesn't come, Elijah doesn't come to separate people, to say you're in and you're out, or to decide lineages, right, that exclude people. he comes to make peace in the world. And this is what the Rambam says. And I think this goes straight to that question. He says that there is no avel b'yuchsin. If I can, yichus, this might actually come as an insult to a lot of people. Yichus, or something that people take a lot of pride in, or one's lineage, doesn't mean much to Maimonides. It doesn't mean much, because what we all relate to, really what gives birth to us all, is the truth. That our yichus meaning the thing that bonds all of humanity is the truth, regardless of color of skin, regardless of creed, even regardless of religion. And so that's a I think might respond to that the Maimonidean model. And that's not to say there aren't problems either, for instance, in his code where he treats some people differently than others. But generally speaking, there is this universalist trend in Maimonides that is, I think, a much better model than, let's say, the Kabbalistic trend.
So, and I'll conclude with this. Essentially, one of the things that one might draw from this whole discussion tonight is we talked about the issue of human suffering and prayer. And in areas like that, the Kabbalistic God of Nachmanides and Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is the more soothing and more comforting God. And when it comes to making sense of social issues in the world today, and a Jew looking at his role and his place in the family of man, the universalist God of Rambam is the one who provides us with greater comfort and a greater sense of feeling that we are in sync with the rest of the world. So it's not so simple. A person can't say, well, I'm a Rambam guy or I'm a Kabbalah guy. You know, it's very, very messy sometimes. And it certainly provides us with food for thought as we go forward through life. And we try to pursue this very elusive truth that both of you have spoken about in the context of the Rambam. I'd like to thank both of you, Dr. Kenneth Green and Dr. James Diamond, for your valuable wisdom, for your time, and for enhancing our evening and just giving us a lot of things to think about. For those who were on the Zoom call, you should know that this will be available on my Facebook page. We'll also share it on the Buy It Facebook page. So if you want to review it, go over something that wasn't clear, you'll always have that opportunity. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Rabbi Krofkin.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks to everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi.